So I do a lot of development using the Laravel framework. I know there's a lot of different ways to get up and running with Laravel. You can use Vagrant and VirtualBox, and there's built-in sail features inside of Laravel. But I wanted to understand Docker at a deeper level, and I wanted to understand how to put services together. So I built my own Laravel Docker starter package, and I'm going to share that with you today. In order to run Docker containers on your computer, you're going to need something like Docker Desktop installed. I've already installed this for my Mac, but I'll leave this URL in the description below so you can come here, grab the version that you need to install, and install it. So this starter kit is available on GitHub, and I'll share a link to the GitHub project in the video description below. My plan is to do a quick code review of all of this at the end of the video, but for now, let's use this starter kit to get Laravel up and running. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy what I need to clone this repo. So the other thing I've done is I've created a desktop directory called Laravel, and I've opened PHP Storm to that directory. So you can see right now that that directory is empty. And then normally what I do is I have two kind of terminal tabs open. One is going to be for our code, and the other is for my Docker environment. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clone that starter package into this directory. And so now you can see that we've cloned that repository locally here into this Docker directory. So to get the Laravel code itself, I'm going to go to the Laravel repo, and I'll share a link to this below. Where I want to land is I want to have the Laravel framework, and I want to build my own application using this framework. So for now, I'm just going to download the Laravel framework, and I'm going to stick it into that Laravel directory on my desktop. So here we are inside that Laravel directory, and you can see the zip file I just downloaded. So I'm going to unzip this. So I don't need the zip file anymore. And I'm going to rename this to code. And so now when we're back in PHP Storm, we have all the code bits that we need to get going. So we have the Docker starter package in the Docker folder, and we have the Laravel framework in the code folder. So many times I develop multiple Laravel applications at the same time. So I would have this same structure, but this would be for application 1, and I would replicate that for application 2 and application 3. And then we'll talk about what we have to change in the Docker file in a moment, just so that those don't collide. All right, let's set up our Docker environment. So the first thing is I will point you to the README file. The README file contains all of the configuration steps that we're going to kind of go through, and probably in deeper detail as far as what each element in the environment file means and what you can change it to. I'll leave that for you to read on your own. But for now, let's go ahead and take the first step, which is copying this environment example file to just a .env. So in this file, we're going to find all the environment variables and their settings to what we need them to be. So for example, at the very top, you can see some application specific settings. So this is the application name. This is the URL that it's going to resolve to. Down here, you can see kind of ports. And so this is important if you have multiple applications. You want to pick ports and domain names and application names that aren't going to collide. So for most part, we're going to use the out-of-the-box configuration. I do happen to know that the latest version of Laravel requires PHP 8.1. So we're going to put PHP 8.1 and we're going to make that change. And for everything else, we're going to use the out-of-the-box values for this. The next thing that we are going to do is we're going to update our host file. The host file location on a Mac and Windows is a little bit different, but I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to do it on the Mac. So I'm just going to use a text editor to make that change. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new entry to our host file. And this is just so that that domain, which if we look back here in the environment, this app domain is going to resolve to local hosts. We'll just put that in there and we'll save. And so we should be good to go here on all of our changes since we're using a lot of the out of the box. And so the next thing we do is we can start our Docker environment. Again, the prerequisite for this is you have Docker installed on your system here. So we're going to run this docker compose command. And if we break this down a little bit, so this is telling Docker that we have a compose file, and we'll go through the compose file. We'll do a code review of that later on. We're going to run this as a daemon, and the entry point for this is we want you to build this service called Nginx. And again, we'll see that in a little bit, but if I open the Docker file, there is a service here called Nginx, and that's the starting point. And then you'll see that this depends upon some other services, so those will get built also. So I'll run this command, and depending on whether you've run this command before or not, or whether you have these images installed, they may not be cached. And so you can see all these different layers were already cached on my computer. And so the startup was very quick. You know, when you run this for the first time, these won't be cached, and they'll have to download all the images from Docker Hub. And so this will take quite a bit of time. I would say between 5 to 10 minutes if you're running it on the first time, depending on your connection speed. And so here you can see the different services that Docker has started for us. And if we pull up Docker Desktop, and here you can see the ABC_app, which is the name of our application. And you can see all the services that are running under that application. So these are the same services that you see listed here, but just in Docker Desktop. As a final check, let's visit our page and see what we get. And we're not expecting this to work out of the box because we haven't configured Laravel yet, right? So we still need to do some Laravel setup, but this does give us an indication that our services are running, that this URL resolves inside the container. So it's hitting the Nginx container, and the PHP FPM service is handling that request. All right, so now that we've got our Docker containers running, let's take care of this issue. Now, Laravel has not been set up, so that's our next step, is let's go ahead and set up Laravel. And so remember, where we're at, we got the Docker here. Here's our Laravel code. So setting up Laravel is pretty similar to setting up that Docker environment. We're going to copy this config file first. And here we have the default configuration. And we're just going to top down and change what we need to change in order to make this work. So the first thing out of the box is this URL needs to change to what we have here. So we'll just copy and paste that in here. And then as we come down, next thing we're going to change is we're going to update the MySQL connection. Right now, the host, it's looking for a host that's localhost on the computer itself. But remember, we're hosting MySQL, or actually MariaDB in this case, inside of a container. And we're going to let Docker resolve this for us. So all we need to do is we need to put the service name that we have in Docker for MySQL here. So if we go back to our Docker compose file, you'll see all the service names listed on the side. So here's the service name for MySQL, and we're just going to copy that service name and we're going to drop it in here. So instead of 127.0.0.1, put that service name. We're not going to change this port because this is the port inside the container, which is the default port. We will change the database. So the database name is, if we go back to our Docker environment file, the database name is ABC_DB. And inside the environment file, we can also see that we're using a user name called Laravel and a password called secret. So we'll just update those. Next thing is we're going to change the cache driver to Redis. So since we've got a Redis instance running, we're going to go and use that. And so we're also going to do the session driver as Redis. And then we're going to do the same thing for the Redis host. Instead of localhost, if we look into our composer file, Redis is hosted with a service called Redis. So we'll just copy that service name and we're going to put that right here. And again, you leave that port the same because that's inside the container once it's resolved inside the container. And everything else we're going to leave as is. We'll just save that. So let me just close up these things and talk about the next step. So the next step on a Laravel application is Laravel is a PHP application, and the PHP package management system is called Composer. And so Laravel uses Composer to compose packages and bring them all in. So we're going to have to pull those packages in using Composer. And then similarly, it has JavaScript packages that it pulls in through NPM. And so we're going to pull those in next. And the instructions to do that are back here in the Docker README file that we already had. So let's open this up again. And so what we're going to have to run, we've done this, we've got Docker installed, we've Docker composed up, but here's the next steps is we use Composer to install the Composer dependencies and NPM to install the NPM dependencies. So let's run those commands here. So Docker compose, we're going to run, and --rm, that flag means after you're done running this command, you can remove this container. And we're going to run the service called Composer. And so this is a service called Composer. So we look at the Docker compose file and we search in here, we'll find a Composer service, and we'll talk about this setup when we review the code later on. But for now, that's the name of the service. And then we want to run this install command. And now Composer's doing its thing, and it's pulling down all of the Composer packages, and we can watch it work here. And so Composer's completed, and now you'll see if you look at your Laravel code directory, you'll have this vendor folder, and inside that vendor folder, these are all the packages that Composer just downloaded. And now we're going to do the same thing for this NPM. So we're going to run Docker compose. Use the --rm so it removes the container when we're done. The contain or the service is called npm, and we're going to run the install command. And now we're going to let npm do its thing. And so now you'll see up here there's a node modules directory added to our code, and inside that node modules are all the JavaScript packages that we need. So at this point we should be able to refresh this page and these errors should go away. And we get one step further, and the final step here before this will function is we need to generate this app key, and Laravel makes this pretty easy. We just have to click this button and it should do it for us. And now if we refresh the page, and we get our Laravel application. Next thing, let's talk about how you would do some of the normal things you do when you're developing Laravel applications. One of the common things is you have to run artisan commands. And so here's an example of running an artisan command. So we'll use our Docker compose. Again, we'll run with the flag, and then the service we want to use is called artisan. And again, if you look in the Composer file, you will find an artisan service. And so again, we'll talk about this entry point and all that stuff later on, but for now, let's go ahead and run a artisan command. I know out of the box, Laravel usually comes with some migrations that it would like you to run, so we're just going to run the migrate command. And you can see it's run those migrations. So if I pull in my database tool, I'm using Data Grip. Again, it's another JetBrains product. I already have kind of the connection, but we'll just look at the connection here real quick for this ABC app. And you can see I'm hosting it localhost. I put the port number for what it looks like on the host here. And I put in Laravel and secret for this. And that's all I needed to do for this connection. But now if I come in here and I refresh this database, we should see some new tables. So now we have 5 tables, and these should match the migrations that we just ran. So users table, password failed, and so you can see all of those here. So another very common thing that we have to do in Laravel development is we create jobs, and we put these jobs on the queue. We let Laravel Horizon then manage the workers that service those jobs. So just real quick, let's install Horizon. I think that's a good example of other things we can do with this. And so Laravel Horizon is here. The instructions for this. And so you can see what information it has, and it's got a nice UI. But then here's where we install. So there's a composer require Laravel Horizon. And we're going to run this command. So we're not going to run it directly, but we're going to run Docker compose. And we're going to use our service, which is Composer, and we can run it from here like this. And so now when we're done, all of the composer packages to support Horizon have been installed. Let's pull back in our website here. Our next instruction is we need to run this artisan command. And so that's the artisan command we're going to run to install Horizon. So let's go ahead and do that. And again, we're not going to do that directly, but we're going to have to use our composer service. And here's an example of running an artisan command again. So we'll go docker compose. We use the well, I guess run first and then --rm. And then we're going to run the artisan command that we just copied. So after that, it talks about the configuration and other elements. So let's just go ahead and take a quick look at the config file for Horizon. Inside this config file allows you to control how Horizon works. And in particular, most of the things you're going to do on the very bottom is you're going to set up for whatever environment you're running in, how many workers or processors are actually running. But for now, we're going to close this up. We're just going to use the defaults. And we do have a service in our Docker Compose called Horizon, so we can start this up. So let's just go ahead and do that. And the -d flag, if you remember before, that's saying, hey, run this as a daemon. So let's run it as a service. So we have something started. If we go back to our Docker desktop now, we actually see the Horizon container is running. And so now I should be able to go to a /Horizon endpoint, and it will load up the dashboard for Horizon. And so now you can see the Horizon dashboard. And right now there's no jobs running, but it's waiting for a job to be put on the queue so it can process it for you. And that pretty much completes everything. There are a couple of interactive shell commands that you can do. So for example, if you ever want to pop into your PHP container, you can do that. You can docker compose. And because it's already running, we can just run this interactive shell inside of the running container, which is called PHP. And we'll just do bin/sh. And so now we're inside the container. And then if we just do php-v, you can see the version of PHP. But inside of here, you could access anything that you normally would want to access inside of the container. So normally you wouldn't do a lot inside the containers itself. It's more useful for kind of troubleshooting. But I wanted to show you just in case you needed to get inside the container. And so that is it for how to use this Docker starter kit. So we went through how to install and configure the starter kit itself. We also went through how to install and configure Laravel, just the default application. And we talked about some of the services that you can run. And so to close up this video, I just want to kind of go over what's inside of this Docker, the starter package here. We kind of got it running, but I haven't really addressed kind of what's all in there. And so let's take a look at some of the pieces now. We talked about the environment file already. So this is where you have the variables that you configure your environment in, and you can set the different versions of the applications that you want to pull down from Docker Hub. So the git ignore is telling you kind of a couple of things. Here's a specific environment file for your environment that we want to ignore, but then there's also a data file. So if we look up here in this database area, this is where when you start the MySQL service running, it's actually storing the MySQL database data on your local drive here. So it's not inside the container. So if you stop the container and delete the container, the data is not inside the container. It's here externally on your disk. And then there's the main Docker compose file. And then this file really does what it says. It's composing a number of services. So this is in a format called YAML. And so these services, one service, here is called Nginx, and here's another service called PHP. And each of these services have a configuration. So one of the things every service has is there's some information on how to build the container. So this particular container is going to use this Docker file, which is sitting right here, and we'll look at that in a second. And then we're passing in some arguments. And so this is the syntax for using our environment variables. So this is an environment variable that you'll find here. So Nginx version is right here. And so you can see every time that we do a Docker up or Docker build, we're looking for the most stable version of Nginx. And then we're also passing in the app domain environment variable. Again, we set that at the very top here. Here's the app domain. And those get passed into our Docker file so that we can use those variables when we're building this image. And again, we'll take a look at the Docker file here in a second, but if we look down, see here you can see we're naming the container, and we're naming the container, we're prefixing it with our project name. And so when we pull up the environment file, our project name was abc_app. And if we look at our Docker dashboard, that's where this comes from. abc_app is there. And so all of these services have prefixed abc_app with them, and that's where that's coming from. So this particular service, Nginx, before it can run, it depends upon these services. So it starts these services up first, and then it starts the Nginx service running. So we have ports inside the container, and we need to map them to the host. And so inside the container, port 80 or port 443 are mapped to these variables outside the container. And again, these are variables that are in the environment file for you to set. So HTTPS on host is here, HTTPS on host. So for this particular application, we set it to that port. So another common thing that we have to do with these containers is we take some files that are on our host and we map those to a directory that's inside the container. So this is inside the container, and this is the path that we're trying to map. So this is path to code, and it's an environment variable. And if we look at that, it's a relative path, and it goes to this directory, which is relative from here. We go back one and then into this code folder. So we're sharing this code folder inside the container. And so what we're sharing is our code that resides in our host and we're mapping that to this directory inside the container. And then the last thing is all of these services are on a common network. So the network is here. That's defined at the very top for this network. And again, that's part of our environment file. So that's a complete review of the Nginx service. And again, we haven't looked at this file. We'll look at this in a second, but let's just do a quick review on the other services here too. So here's PHP. This line number 31 is you have to add this for your new Mac support. So if you have an ARM processor, an M2 type of thing for your Mac, you're going to have to force this. This does a little bit of emulation. It makes it a little bit slower. And then the next thing is very similar to the Nginx service, is we're providing some information on how to build it. And again, for the PHP, we're using a PHP Docker file, which is here, and we'll review that in a second. We're passing in some arguments from our environment, our host, which is the PHP version. I'm not going to switch over there. You can go and see that. We're naming the container. We're sharing the volumes. It's the same volume. It's the code. We want to share that code inside the container. And then we're attaching it to that network. And then if you carry on, it's the same thing. MySQL, here's the MySQL service. We don't have a Docker file for this. We're just doing a direct image. We're using the MariaDB image from Docker Hub, and we're setting up MariaDB version. Setting the name. Again, we're sharing ports. So inside port 3306, inside the container, is shared to this port, which is defined in our environment file. And here's where that magic for this database directory comes in. So on our host, that directory, which is here, we want to map that to our varlib MySQL directory, which is where MySQL natively wants to store the data for the database. So when it writes data to this directory inside, thinking it's storing it inside the container, it's actually writing it to the outside world. And that's how we actually persist it across the lifetime of our container. And then we're attaching it to the network again. And then for this particular container, there are some setup for MySQL, and you need to have these environment variables on the container so that you can actually set up MySQL automatically. And the rest of the services follow the same pattern. We're not going to go into all the details, but Composer, again, it's run on my Mac, so I have to have this there. It's building. It's using the same PHP Docker file for the build. We're naming the container. It's got shared volumes. And so here are two new Composer lines that we haven't seen in the previous services. First, we set a working directory for this service called Composer. And you can see that this working directory is the same directory as the volume that I'm sharing my code to. And so when you execute a command, it's inside of this directory that we're really running a command, which is inside of our code path, which for Laravel, that's inside of here, which is where the artisan command is and where composer is. So it's important that we set this working directory. So this working directory works in combination with this entry. So when I run this command, docker compose run --rm, and I specify the service, it knows that it's going to use this container to run that command. And then what it does is inside that container, it goes to this, and really what it's doing under the hood is it's going to run these two first, and I'll show you that in a second. But then I run some command here. So composer, say install, whatever that was before. So inside this container, then in this directory, really what's going to happen is it's going to run this command. It's going to run php/bin/composer.var, and then it's going to take the command that I stuck on the end and put it on the end of here, install. And so this is running composer install inside of this container at that directory. And that's exactly what I want it to do. So if we look at the next service called artisan, it's really set up exactly the same thing as composer. So if we look at artisan, it's using, this is the information to build this container. It's using that PHP dockerfile, and again, we'll review that in a second. Names the container, it maps volumes in, and then here's the two working directory and entry point that work together. So the working directory is the same directory as I'm sharing my code to, which is here. And then the entry point is going to run PHP artisan. So if I run this docker command right here, so it's going to start the container for the service called artisan. And inside, it's going to go to this working directory, which is the same directory as the code. And then it's going to run PHP artisan, which is the entry point here, commands. And then it's going to put down whatever I put at the end of my command, which is migrate. And that's exactly what I want it to do. And we won't go over the details, but npm has the same thing. It's running off of an image that's directly from the Docker hub. We name the container. I share the code into there. I set the working directory as this directory here. And then you can see here's the npm command. So it's running npm and then whatever command that I type on the end. So again, if I type in something like docker compose run npm, and then I want to do install. So this is the name of the service that tells it what container to start, and then it's going to go to this working directory. It's going to start with an entry point npm, and then it's going to put on whatever I add to the end of there. PHP unit's very similar. I won't cover this one, but you can see it's got a working directory and an entry point, and the entry point is a little bit different, but it's same concept as before. So the next service is Redis. Redis uses a Docker Hub image directly. So it does expose a port here, and that port's configurable inside our environment file. And that way it does expose this port. So if we want to connect to it on our host, we can connect to it there. The next service is Horizon. Horizon is pretty similar to the Artisan. It has the same PHP Docker image that we're using. Here's the container name. We're mapping in our code. We're setting our working directory. And then here's the command to run Horizon. So if we look back up Nginx, it's at the very top. It depends on the PHP, the MySQL, and the Redis. So those three things are started first, and then it starts up the Nginx container. Again, this is instructions on how to build this image. That's what Docker's using this for. So this Docker file contains instructions on how to build the Nginx image that we can use to start up that service. So I'll try to point out anything that's kind of special. So generally this is using the Nginx Alpine image from Docker Hub. And again, we get to set the version from our environment file. It's getting this information because we're passing it in as arguments, and that's how those are working. So I look here, it's getting the Nginx version, and it's gonna use this as a base image. And then how Docker works is every time you run one of these commands, it kind of adds to that base image another layer. And so it just builds up these layers until we get to the final image at the very bottom. And this isn't a long Docker file. This next line uses Alpine's package management command to install OpenSSL. So on line 9, we're just removing the default config for Nginx, and on line 11, we're actually going to install our own. And we're installing it from our local machine. So this is our local machine's kind of website config, and let's go look at that next. So under here, here's website config. So this is just a typical Nginx file. I mean, this top part defines a server that listens on port 80, and the bottom part defines a server that's listening on port 443. This server on port 80 is doing a 301 redirect to our secure server, which is down here on 443. And on line 11, we're actually telling it where to find the code. And if you notice here, this beginning part, and if we go back to our Docker compose file for Nginx, we're actually saving our code to this volume, which is the same thing as this directory here. And so we're going one more directory in, which is our public folder. And so if you understand how Laravel works, that's our entry point. Right here's our public folder, and there's our index.php. That's the very first file that gets loaded every time you do a request to a Laravel application. It goes and loads up this, and it starts the application from there. And so we're configuring Nginx to start where it needs to start here, and it's looking for one of these files in this directory, and it's going to find this one. So the rest of this is pretty boilerplate. I will point out a few things here. So, Nginx uses PHP FPM to kind of process the PHP pages that it's serving up. And you can see right here, it's calling something PHP. And the reason it's doing that is that's the container name for the Docker container that's going to process the PHP for us. And so these containers are kind of interconnected that way. And so we use that PHP container name, which again, if we look in our Docker compose file, that matches this service name right there. And so that's why that's here for this, and it's on port 9000. And we'll see that later on. We're going to run everything on port 443. We do need a certificate installed, and so we are configuring this server to run these certificates. And these paths, we're going to see these paths just in a second here, but these certificates are self-generated when you actually set up the image. So the next couple of commands, we're making sure that that directory exists. Here's where we're going to start to set up those certificates for the Nginx server. So we're going to make sure that this directory exists. And then on line 17, we're going to take this local directory and we're going to actually map it to a directory that's inside this container. So if we look at what this local directory here contains, and we're sharing this inside the container itself. So it contains a couple of shell scripts. And then on line number 19 is we're going to switch into the directory we just created where we shared those shell scripts. And then we're going to execute the shell script. So we execute this one first, and then we execute this certificate creation script next. And then we're going to pass in this app domain variable. And again, we exposed that in our Docker compose file, which is right here, app domain, which we set through our environment, which is right here. So that's the app domain. So when it creates that certificate, it's actually going to create a certificate for this domain. And that's how that function works right there. And I'm not even going to open up these scripts right now, but you can look in there. They're just shell scripts that you would normally do manually, entering a bunch of commands to create a certificate. It's just kind of automating it for you. And then on this final layer, we're just going to take those new scripts that we just created and put them into the Nginx directory that we need them on, which is where we specified them down here at the very bottom. So this etc Nginx certs directory, that's what this last thing, it's putting those, it's copying those certs that we just created into that directory so they can be used by Nginx. And this is the Docker file that creates the Nginx. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this Docker file. This Docker file tells Docker how to build the image that's used by this PHP service. But I want to point out that that image is also used by this composer service, and it's used by this artisan service. And if you scroll down, you can see it's used by a number of other services here. So let's dive into this PHP Docker file. This one's a bit longer, and you can see the different layers it's doing. So remember, every line is kind of adding a new layer. So let's start with a base layer that's using an FPM Alpine image with the version that we passed in. So remember, in the Docker compose file, this argument, PHP version, which is I'm getting from our environment variable, we're passing it into the Docker file here. And so this is telling Docker, hey, start with this PHP version 8.1. And then everything below that is just adding a layer to configure this PHP file so it has all the components that we need it to do. So for example, here's a security. We're adding a new group called Laravel. Here, we're making sure that this directory exists. So we're running an upgrade command on this image just to make sure that we're up to date. So in line 13, you can see that we're using the Alpine package management to install a bunch of packages. And these are PHP modules. And I tried to add everything into this image that I needed for my development. So you'll see things like support for LDAP. You may not need that, but it's in there. So if you want to use it, you can absolutely use it. And the next thing is we're installing a couple more packages here. So this section here installs the Microsoft SQL Server ODBC connectors so that you can talk to SQL Server databases. And there's two different versions here. I left this in here. This is commented out. This is the old version, version 17, for some reason that you need that version. But right now we're running the version 18. And I believe this is currently the only reason why that this particular container can't run natively under the ARM processor is I can't find a package that is compiled for this SQL Server ODBC connectors that will run on ARM. So right now this is running under the AMD, and that's why we have to emulate this under AMD right now. So I'm hoping in the future here soon that we'll be able to get an ODBC connector for Microsoft SQL Server that is natively compiled for the ARM processor. And we're going to kind of skim through the rest of these layers here kind of quickly, but you can see we're installing Redis. Here's more of the PHP extensions for LDAP. Here's a few additional PHP extensions that we're installing. So I did run into some kind of nastiness with different PHP versions not supporting certain things. I tried to work that out here. There's nothing in here for PHP 8.1, so none of these libraries are actually installed with this current image. But if you're using 8.0 or 7.4, then you'll get some additional features. We're doing a little bit of cleanup here. So here we're actually going to copy a few files from our host inside the container. So let's take a look at these files real quick. So these are under our PHP directory, which is here. And so you can see those files. And so the first one is this www.conf file. And you can see where it's going to land. This is for PHP. The FPM daemon has this conf file. And so this is the conf file for that daemon. And we're setting the different users up at the very top of our Docker file. Remember, we created those user groups and everything. And so now we're starting to use those inside our configuration. We're listed on port 9000. And remember, that's what Nginx was sending PHP requests to. So those two ports map up. And then we're just setting some kind of boilerplate stuff here. I didn't change any of this. And the next file here is the ini file for PHP. I'm not going to go over all of these settings, but it's external. So it's not in the container. So if you want to have a special PHP configuration set up, you can do that here. If you're using LDAP, then you need to have this file in here, and we're sharing it, so you can take a look at this. So if you don't have this file, then what happens is when you do a LDAP request on a server where the certificate doesn't match, you're going to get an error. And so this is just saying, hey, we know what we're doing, let's ignore that error. So the next file that we're adding is the cron-tab file. And so if we look at the cron-tab file and see what it does here, so it every minute, so cron wakes up once a minute and it does something. So this job here on this line is going to run every minute. And every minute it goes in and it changes directory to our code directory. Remember, that's how we shared it into our image. And then it runs this PHP artisan schedule command. And so Laravel has the ability where you can schedule commands to run at a regular interval. So for example, I have a job that I want to run once a day. So I can schedule to run once a day. I have a job that I want to run every 10 minutes or 5 minutes. And it's a pretty robust system, but this is the entry point for that. So when you do PHP artisan schedule run, it looks at all the jobs you've configured, and then it puts those jobs on the queue if they haven't been run in that desired interval. So it takes care of it for us. And if we go back to our Docker compose file, you can see this cron service here is using the same image as our PHP, so it has access to All of our code has access to this cron file. And so this is the service that we need to run if we ever want our scheduled jobs to run. In my dev environment, I typically don't have this running, and that's why it's not a dependency on the Nginx at the very top. So if we carry on our Docker file, the next layer is we're installing Composer. Again, we're using Composer to install all the PHP packages, so we need Composer to be installed on this image. So this is the next line that we're installing that. We do change ownership of the actual code directory inside the container so that Laravel owns it. And remember, that's the user that we set up here at the top, so that Laravel user now has permission to do things inside of this directory. And it needs to own this folder because it has to be able to, for example, create the vendor folder when you do Composer install. And at the very bottom, you can see additional layers that I've added over the years. So this layer is installing LibreOffice and some other Microsoft fonts. You know, as part of a project that I had, I wanted to be able to take a Microsoft document template, replace some like macros inside that template with data, and then convert it to a PDF. So I needed this library to be able to do that. And the last layer is I installed Samba. This is a Linux container, and sometimes your Linux container needs to reach out and, you know, connect to like Windows shares. And so with Samba, you can use Samba to SMB, connect to a different Windows share, and, you know, get data from those drives. So that completes our review of all of the different code in the Docker startup package. You know, I use this Docker startup package a lot, and I'm always improving it. So feel free to use this in your own projects. If you have improvements that you find, let me know. I'm happy to add those too. So if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe.